the moral argument for God's existence. And then my subtitle here, Can You Be Good Without God? So if you are in my UTT class, this is the second formal argument that I will be giving you. So this is one of those that you need to memorize and be able to defend. So now the good news is this is a really easy, straightforward, and I think logically airtight argument. So in this video or series of videos, I'm not sure how it's going to work out yet, we're going to look at this very simple argument. We're going to look at the objections to it and how to defend the argument against the objections. Now let me just remind you that arguments always have two components. You've got to have premises and a conclusion. Typically you'll have at least two premises. Your premises are your reasons or your evidence, and then your conclusion is kind of like the therefore. In other words, for these two reasons, I believe this to be true. And so that's what we're going to look at with regard to the moral argument for God's existence. Another great thing about this argument is that people tend to agree with the premises. There aren't a lot of arguments against them. And so if the premises are true, then the conclusion should follow from it. And I'm going to show you how that works. So let's talk about what this argument means. Or actually, let's talk about the nature of morality for just a second. Now, a lot of what I'm sharing with you comes from a book called On Guard by William Lane Craig, who is one of my all-time favorite Christian apologists. But he talks about the nature of morality. And I want to read a quote from the book. William Lane Craig is talking about a guy named William Sorley, who was a moral philosophy professor at Cambridge University. He wrote a book called Moral Values and the Idea of God in 1918. And I'm just going to read what Craig writes in his book On Guard about Sorley's idea with regard to morality. And listen very carefully to this. Craig writes, Sorley maintains that there is an objective moral order which is as real and independent of us as is the natural order of things. He recognizes that in one sense we can't prove that objective moral values exist, but he points out that in the same sense we can't prove that the natural world of physical objects exists either. And then in parentheses, you could be a body lying in the matrix experiencing a virtual reality. The moral order and natural order are thus on a similar footing. Just as we assume the reality of the world of objects on the basis of our sense experience, so we assume the reality of the moral order on the basis of our moral experience. And let me put it like this. I need things broken down into simple ideas. And so let me ask this. How do you know the physical world exists? How do you know that you're not a brain in a vat somewhere, and that really what you think is the real world, what you think is the physical world, are just electrical stimuli to your brain? How do you know? Could you prove that you're not a brain in a vat? You really couldn't. And morality is kind of the same way. How do we know the physical world exists? Because of our sense experience. It tells us that the physical world exists, that what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch around us, it's real. It actually exists. Well, moral experience tells us that there's a moral order. There are some things that we all know are morally wrong. There are some values that we hold that are morally right. And so this is where we begin with this argument. This is why this argument really works. It's because we all have moral experience that tells us about the moral order. Okay, now with that little introduction, let's look at the argument itself. It's very simple. If there is no God, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Now, if you're in my UTT class, you should note that this is not any more complicated than the cosmological argument. And that one goes, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And so this one is just as simple. If there is no God, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Now we're going to break it apart a little bit, and we're going to look at each premise. So you've got number 1 and number 2, which are the premises, and then number 3 is the conclusion. So let's talk about this a bit, and we're going to focus in on premise number 1, and we're going to focus in on some words that are very specific. Now you know that I'm really picky about certain words. You can fudge a little bit on these arguments, but some of these main words you have to get exactly right, or the argument doesn't work. And here's a big one. You must include the word objective. You can't just say, if there's no God, moral values and duties do not exist. You got to include the word objective. Otherwise, you will be off the rails to begin with, and you will lose this argument. You must include the word objective. And so let's talk about what objective means. And let me give you a definition of objective. All right, objective means that something is independent of opinion. Now the opposite of objective is subjective. If something is subjective, that means it's dependent on people's opinions. So let's talk about objective morality. Objective morality means that something is right or wrong, no matter what your opinion of it may be. And so let me give you an example here. And I'm telling you what, Hitler and the Nazis did a lot of terrible things, but one good thing they did provide was an example of objective evil. And no doubt you've heard about the Holocaust, the Nazis' attempt to eliminate the Jews in Germany and in all of Europe. You got to ask yourself, was that morally wrong? Well, I'm gonna say, and I'm not going out on a limb here, that attempting to exterminate an entire group of human beings was objectively morally wrong. It was morally evil, objectively so. It's wrong no matter who you are. It would have been wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and convinced everybody that it was the right thing to do. It still would have been morally wrong for the Holocaust to happen. All right, so the Holocaust was objectively, morally wrong. That's what we mean. It's not open to opinion. And so that's why you got to get this word in here, because people will, they'll have a heyday with you if you don't include the word objective. And I also think it will steer you back to what the topic is. The topic is objective morality. Subjective just means that it's your opinion. Okay, I think I've beaten that one to death, so let me move on just a little bit more with this argument. So if there is no God, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, what are these things? What are we talking about, values and duties? Well, here's what we mean. A value means that something is good or bad. It's something that's intrinsically good or bad. We're talking about the nature of things. For example, being a doctor is good. It's intrinsically good to be a doctor. Things like courage. Courage is something that is intrinsically good. On the other hand, being a drug dealer is intrinsically bad. Okay? You see the difference? Greed, I think we could say, is intrinsically bad. Now, what about duties? Well, duties are right or wrong. Duties are actions. Duties are obligations. Now let me contrast this. I just said that being a doctor is intrinsically good. Does that mean then, well, let me back up. Being a doctor is, well, it's a good value. It's objectively, morally good in that sense, that it's intrinsically good. But because it's good, do you have a duty to be a doctor? And the answer is no. You do not have a duty to be a doctor. All right? If something is a duty, it's an obligation that's placed on you. And so that's what we're looking at here. We're talking about objective moral values, that is the nature of things, or objective moral duties, right or wrong actions. Okay? For example, murder is an objectively, morally evil action because we have a duty not to kill innocent people. So that's the difference. Now, I know it sounds kind of complicated so far, but you're going to have to trust me on this. This is really not a complicated argument. Okay, I think I'm going to stop the video here and continue in part 2.